advice to the minister.
Okay, we're.
Right, there's a lot on this one, and at the very end, Pierre Poilevre speaks twice, so watch that one, both of them. Very interesting. Charlie Angus does a lot. MP Barrett. This is just an amazing amount.
In early May. To be clear, the department's recommendation was that a contribution agreement with We Charity to mobilize other not-for-profit partners was the best available option given the requirement for speed, scope, scale, and to reach a broad diversity of youth. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Wernick. So we will now go to questions, be a 6-minute round. First up, Mr. Poilevre, then Ms. Zerowitz. Mr. Poilevre, floor is yours.
Ms. Wernick, you said that the We Charity sent a proposal to ministers and officials for a social entrepreneurship program. Then you described how that proposal converted through your recommendation into this Canada Student Service Grant. To how many officials and ministers did we originally send this proposal?
Mr. Chair, I don't have that information in front of me, but I'm happy to provide that in writing to the committee.
Who first informed you that we had made this proposal to the government?
So We Charity, as I mentioned, I reached out to them in the context of exploring options,
right,
and they told me about the proposal. I was also aware, because we had prepared a briefing note for Minister Chagger, that she had received a copy of the proposal, and We Charity mentioned that they had shared it with Minister Ng. I would like to clarify for the committee that this was a separate proposal, but when I was provided a new proposal, it had adapted that one, which had been developed over some time, to adapt to the new parameters set out by the government in the announcement.
Mr. Poilevre.
And when did you first hear of the We Charity proposal?
When I spoke with We Charity in the lead up to the announcement.
On what date?
I spoke to the We Charity on April 19th.
So April 19th, you spoke to them, and that was the first time you heard about the We Charity proposal?
To the best of my recollection, however, it is true that that proposal had been shared with ministers.
When?
So as I have said, Mr. Chair, we will provide those details in writing.
Did anyone ever tell you whether any ministers had opinions about the We Charity proposal? Prior to your recommending in favor of it?
I need to clarify, Mr. Chair, that the proposal I'm speaking about is a different proposal that I believe was adapted following the announcement and submitted.
Right. And so my question, again, it doesn't change. Can you answer it, please?
I'm sorry, can you repeat? It's not clear to me what the question is.
Did anyone tell you the opinions of any of the ministers on this proposal that We Charity had circulated within cabinet?
I have no recollection of that.
All right. So now we know that this whole thing originated with We, and that it was then adapted slightly to meet the political demands of the government. And so who was it that told you to work on a Canada Student Grant like this? Was it your deputy?
Mr. Chair, as I explained in my remarks, there was, in a very brief time, in the context of the crisis back in April, there was a few days, there were a few, if I could finish.
Just Mr. Poilevre, give the Ms. Wernick the time to respond, if you could. We'll not take time away from you. Go ahead, Ms. Wernick.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. There was a very rapid period of a few days in which officials were working very hard to quickly assess options and possibilities for a student and youth package announcement. It was in that context that I was asked by my Associate Deputy Minister and in collaboration with officials at the Department of Finance to provide some options, assessments, information, given my lead on the Canada Service Corps program.
Okay, this is
file.
sort of way off of my, so it sounds like it was an associate deputy minister who asked you to do that. So that was all I needed to know. There was a proposal from we. Who first gave you that proposal?
The proposal, I received a proposal, Mr. Chair, I received a proposal from Craig Kielberger on April 22nd.
On April 22nd, and did he just call you?
I received it by email, Mr. Chair.
Did he mention if he had spoken to other members of the government about it?
I have no recollection of that.
And the proposal at that time, was it for the government to provide a grant for volunteer positions?
To the best of my recollection, no, it was emphasizing still some placements for youth related to entrepreneurship, social entrepreneurship, and additional placements for youth related to service in their communities.
And how many total, in the final proposal that went through cabinet, the Canada, how many positions was the, were going to be created for the proposed budget of $912 million?
So, Mr. Chair, as you know, I'm not able to speak to cabinet confidence of what's in a cabinet document.
No, but the proposal, it was made public. There's a public proposal to spend $912 million on creating student service grants. How many students would have had positions?
The way that the proposal was designed was that of the, as was mentioned earlier, I think there was an envelope of funding put against payment of grants. The payment of the grants was going to be aligned with uptake by students and the completion of the necessary hours to get those grants.
Okay, we're out of time on this round, but Mr. Poilevre, stick with me for a minute, will you?
Yes.
Because I do see some on clarity. It's not a right word, I guess, but I do see some problems here. I thought in your remarks, Ms. Wernick, you indicated you approached we. And Mr. Poilevre, in his statement a minute ago, and I might not have this, you can correct me if I'm wrong, Pierre, he basically said that the proposal originated with we to meet the political, I don't know whether the word was demand of the government or desire of the government. We're miles apart on those two statements. So what we really, is that statement correct, that the proposal originated with we? Or did you, I believe in your remarks, indicated that you made the first initiative to talk to we as one of the organizations? Where are we at here? Let's establish the foundation that we're actually dealing with facts here, if I could. So Ms. Wernick, can you clarify where we're at?
Yes, Mr. Chair.
That's okay. I used to be in the good old days. Go ahead.
So, as I mentioned in my statement, in the context of working very quickly to input into a student announcement that was going to happen in a few days, we were exploring very quickly potential options and thinking about who could potentially help the government in that space. And as I mentioned, in the context of developing the student package and assessing options, My recollection is that We Charity was one of the options that came up in discussions, given their experience as the largest youth serving organization in Canada. I called We Charity on April 19th to seek some input on the program concept. Then, as I mentioned in my statement, I learned the details of what the government wanted for a Canada Student Service grant through the Prime Minister's announcement. Following that announcement, I received by email a proposal from We Charity. This is not the same thing as saying what went to Cabinet. This is saying that a third party hearing about the announcement submitted a proposal.
Okay, that clarifies it for me.
It's not clear though, Chair.
I will give Mr. Poilevre basically. Ms. Wernick approached we on April 19th. On April 22nd, she got an email from Craig Kerber. I'll give you another minute or so because this is important. Mr. Poilevre.
So to be clear, you contacted we on the 19th, and then Mr. Kielburger came back to you with a proposal on the 22nd. Is that the order?
Yes, Mr. Chair.
Had he contacted you prior to the 19th?
No, as I mentioned, I contacted him on the 19th.
You contacted him on the 19th to ask him for that. And so he had knowledge that this program was going to be announced by the Prime Minister before the public did.
I contacted him on the broad parameters and scope of what we were talking about, how to engage youth to get involved in service, issues around quick implementation. And my recollection of the conversation on the broad concepts with Mr. Kielburger was that he raised lots of expertise and concerns related to youth and engaging youth, and that not-for-profits were struggling in the COVID context, that it would be very challenging to keep them safe. So it would require virtual placements. And he gave some expertise as one of the largest youth service organizations on the concept.
I am going to move on, but I'll give you time to think about where we're at here too, Pierre, and maybe you'll have to come back in a little later. I'll go.
Includes the terms of the conditions of the program, and this proposal will help us advance the objectives of the program. We always have to do that analysis. Question: did you have a call for proposals?
Question était, y a-t-il eu un appel? Président, vous voulez pas entendre les questions?
Mr. Chairman, you don't want to hear the questions? I asked a simple question, and for 5 minutes, it seems as though there's prevarication, beating around the bush. I'd like to know whether there is a call for proposals that was supposed to happen at the time, but then there's all these explanations as to the proposals being analyzed. I believe that. But the question, is there a call for proposal? Mr. Chairman, I can answer that question. There was no call.
Said. Did you finish your answer, Ms. Hebert? Ms. Hebert? Okay. Okay, then turning to Mr. Angus, around 6 minutes. Charlie, we've been running over a fair little bit. Go ahead, floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And just, are we going to go with the standard we've been doing in the House? I'm going to keep my question short if we can get short answers that we want to talk about.
I will try reasonably, but keep in mind I do not mind committee members kind of browbeating politicians. We're used to it. I don't want to see that happen with public servants. So go ahead and we'll give it a try. Floor is yours.
Okay, thank you so much, and thank you, Madame Wernick. So prior to the announcement on April 19th, if I understand you, there was a proposal from we that was circulating. It wasn't the same proposal, but it was a proposal. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay. And was that, do you know where that proposal was circulated? Did it like to
As I
cabinet
mentioned
to minister?
previously, I would prefer to provide that to the committee to ensure completeness and accuracy of information by writing.
Certainly, and you would provide the proposal as well?
Yes, this is possible.
Thank you so much. I guess because we're here for two reasons. One is certainly the connections to the Trudeau family that raised a lot of alarm bells, but the sense that because of the close connection with the Kielburgers and the Prime Minister that they got the inside track. So if there was a proposal that influenced the Prime Minister and you doing your due diligence as a civil servant called me and
Charlie, Mr. Angus, Charlie, I don't want to interrupt, but hold up your mic. The translators are having a bit of difficulty, and we want to hear the pureness of your voice.
Oh, thank you, Wayne. I'm so sorry. Who's ever said that I wasn't loud enough? You're the first. So the question is whether or not we got the inside track. So if there was a proposal that the Prime Minister loved and then laid out the basic parameters. So when you call 3 days later, Kielburger's already, he's got the ideas, he's set to go. Is it possible that because they had already circulated this, that the Prime Minister set it up and then so you dutifully followed through?
Ms. Wernick?
Mr. Chair, I cannot speculate, but I can tell you that in the context that I was in mid-April, in a crisis situation, I gave some options and assessments to inform the announcement by the Prime Minister on April 22nd, based on my expertise and experience with various organizations. And based on an understanding that there was a desire to launch this initiative within 3 weeks because it was a summer initiative that students needed to start taking advantage of as quickly as possible.
Well, thank you for that. I just wanted to really clarify your position in how this is being played out because Minister Chagger said a number of times that this was your idea, that you came up with it, and I don't want you to be wearing this if this was a political decision. So I wanted to just clarify that. So I thank you for that. So the question was raised again about the Trudeau family links, and I asked Minister Chagger if this was raised. It would have seemed to me something that would have been red flagged because of the close connection between the Trudeau family, the fact that his mother and brother and wife were closely involved. Did you raise the Trudeau family connection as a red flag?
Mr. Chair, I don't have any direct knowledge of that. And as I mentioned, the department does not provide assessment of potential conflicts of interest by public office holders. The onus is on those office holders to uphold the guidelines.
Oh, I understand that. I guess that my question was, you know, when you're making a proposal, you're going to have the plus and minuses, and this, you know, this blew up in the government's face. So I was wondering who raised those red flags. So now just about the financing, because we heard 19.5, then we heard 43 million. I'm not interested in that number. I'm interested in the per student placement, other values that would have been identified. The minister said that it would come out later. What was the agreement, say, for onboarding fees and training that we would do? How much could they get per placement?
So, Mr. President, you've been a president and a minister. Mr. Chair, as I mentioned, and as I think my colleagues have mentioned, contribution agreements lay out the funding, the broad program and policy objectives, the desired results, and then it is for the third party to determine, make decisions about how they achieve those results.
So there were other fees, and this is what I'm concerned about, because about due diligence and performance measures. You said you needed a website that had a lot of bang. We find out when it opened, there were 1,500 bogus placements on there. Did you do due diligence on this, or was this something that came up from we?
So, Mr. Chair, I think is not an insufficient understanding of the digital aspects of this. When we were asked by the government to create the I Want to Help platform, our first reflex was to look at our job bank technology. So ESDC had made significant investments in the job bank infrastructure, and it met security and official language requirements. And that was the first phase of work on the platform. In the course of...
sorry. We'll give you time, Mr. Angus. Finish, Ms. Wernick.
So in the course of negotiating the contribution agreement, there was additional requirements for that came forward with respect to registering students' desire for tracking of hours. There was also issues around validating not-for-profits. Are they registered charities? There was a lot of desire to collect data about the students, and so that we could report. And so there was, as I mentioned in my statement, there was significant technological capacity required to ensure both the program requirements, the eligibility requirements, and that due diligence was being done to vet and ensure students were going to safe, legitimate placements.
Thank you.
We'll have to go back to Mr. Angus. Go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. And I'm thankful for the answer. I was asking about the 1,500 bogus placements and due diligence there. But my final question would be in response when I asked Madame Chagger about the possible illegalities of paying post-secondary students well below minimum wage to do work that would be considered paid work, that would put charities in issues of legal liability because you cannot transgress the
Monsieur le Président, point d'ordre.
Point of order, Charlie, just hold on. Mr. Fortin.
Désolé, Monsieur Angus.
I'm sorry, Mr. Angus and Mr. Chair. The interpreter is telling me that she is unable to interpret what Mr. Angus is saying. So I apologize, but...
I believe you're not holding your mic up again. The translators were having trouble, and they were telling Mr. Fortin that, which is good.
Okay.
Go ahead. Start over.
I'll just finish the question then. Is that this plan that would have post-secondary students working well below minimum wage and calling it volunteering puts charities at risk of legal liability if a student says this was actually paid work. So I asked the minister if she had done due diligence and gotten a legal opinion, and she said that she was confident, quote, the public service would have done their due diligence and would have requested a legal opinion. So Madame Wernick, did you get a legal opinion that this plan paying students so much below minimum wage would meet the legal tests under provincial labor law?
Ms. Wernick?
Yes, Mr. Chair, I need to clarify that this was a lump sum financial award, like a bursary at the end of the summer. It was not an hourly wage, and that was the nature of the grant.
But that's not how you presented it. That's not how you presented it, that if they did 100 hours, they got $1,000. If they did 170 hours, they still only got $1,000. They got paid by how much work they did. That's an hourly wage.
Okay,
that's the legal question.
We'll have to conclude it there. I'll let Ms. Wernick answer. And I don't know, Ms. Hebert had her, I thought she might have wanted in earlier, but go ahead, Ms. Wernick.
Very quickly, rewards are like that. Like air miles, you have to reach certain levels before you get a reward. In terms of the illegal advice provided, I'm not privy. I'm not able to speak to that, as you know, because that would constitute advice to ministers and solicitor-client privilege.
Oh, so it was advice to the minister.
Okay, we're.
Ms. Wernick, did anyone suggest you call Mr. Kielburger on April 19th?
Mr. Chair, in the context of the mad rush to consider what could be done for the April 22nd announcement, several different organizations were talked about. And it was in that context that I offered to reach out and speak to We Charity, given that I had
Did you call the
prior-
head of any other organization around the same time?
I personally
That's a
did
yes
not
or no
know.
question. Okay, great. Is it typical that partner organizations are notified that they have been successful in becoming a partner via the Prime Minister's office, as was stated in this case by Mr. Kielburger?
And Ms. Wernick.
I cannot speak to that.
That was a media report, I believe, and Mr. Kielburger clarified that. But surely there must be somebody in ESDC that can clarify that. Ms. Hebert, Ms. Wilson, or Ms. Wernick.
If Mr. Chair, the question is whether or not somebody else talked to somebody else. I'm afraid we cannot speculate or provide opinions on things we don't have direct knowledge on.
Okay,
No,
Mr. Barrett.
Mr. Chair, that's a non-answer. The question was, is it typical that partner organizations are notified that they have been successful in becoming a partner via the Prime Minister's office and not by the ministry, as was stated in this case by the partner? So is it typical, ma'am, that it would be the Prime Minister's office and not you that would contact them? Is that typical?
Let me take a shot at that if that's
Ms. Hebert,
okay.
yeah, go ahead.
I'd be happy to help after Deputy Wilson weighs in.
Just one short answer would be great.
Okay, so sometimes it occurs, sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes it's a minister, sometimes it's a staff person, sometimes it's an employee. It varies, and so nothing is particularly typical.
Okay, so in this case, who notified Mr. Kielburger that they were the successful proponents, and on what date did that occur?
Ms. Wernick, or whoever.
The We Charity was informed that the contribution agreement had been approved on June 23rd.
By who?
I do not have a recollection of who directly notified them.
Okay, Mr. Barrett.
It's interesting, Mr. Chair. On June the 12th, the We Charity announced that they were recruiting for this program during a webcast. So that timeline is inconsistent. Will you submit to the committee the email that you received from Mr. Kielburger that you referenced in a previous answer?
Yes, Mr. Chair, we are collecting all of the information the committee asked for with the deadline, I believe, of August 8th, but we're moving as quickly as we can to pull it all together and get it to the committee.
Okay, and I want to circle back to my last question. So how is it that there is multi-sourced reports and documents it's documented that Mr. Kielburger was recruiting for this program on June the 12th if he was notified, supposedly notified weeks later?
So again, in negotiating and working on a contribution agreement with partners, it is not uncommon that partners begin to reach out to other partners, especially in a third-party model, and to develop the program, to consider what needs to be in the contribution agreement, and in this case, given the very, very tight timeline for launch, to basically advance work as much as possible in order to meet the tight timelines required by the government.
Okay, we'll let it go back to Mr. Barrett. Last question.
To your knowledge, was anyone else in government communicating with we in the days between April 19th to 22nd or about that period?
I have no direct knowledge of that. I can only speak to my own communications.
Okay, thank you.
Well, it looks like there's a bunch of caveats to the story. It's going to be growing. Barrett just picked up a lot of things. Now we have MP Poilevre back at it, and it gets a little tense. But what do you think?
Yes, Ms. Wernick, who told you to call Mr. Kielburger on April 19th?
Mr. Chair, as I have mentioned, there were conversations with finance officials, and in that context of those discussions about potential organizations.
Who asked you to call him that led to your call of April 19th?
In those conversations, We Charity came up, and I volunteered to call them because of my prior work with them.
Who brought them up?
And because they were an obvious choice as the largest youth-serving organization.
Sorry, I just asked a very specific question. Who brought them up? You said they came up. Who brought them up?
Ms. Wernick.
So we were having conversations with Department of Finance, and different organizations were mentioned in that context. I said, well, I know We Charity. I can reach out to them.
So were you the first person that brought up We Charity, or did someone else bring it up before you in the conversation?
To the best of my recollection, it was raised by the Department of Finance officials.
Department of Finance officials. Do you have a name?
The lead official that I was working with was Michelle Kovacevic at the Department of Finance.
And that was the person who brought up We Charity. Sorry, it's just taking a phenomenal amount of time to answer a very simple question.
Well, yeah, but we want proper, accurate information on the record, and not speculation. And
she was there, Chair.
I know she was there, and I know it was a group discussion, is basically what she said. Ms. Wernick, you want to answer?
Yes, that's correct, Mr. Chair. It was a group discussion, and to the best of my recollection, it was in those group discussions that the name came.
So that wasn't the question. And so we've given the name of a finance official. We'll have to assume, unless you later correct the record, that this official was the one that brought up the name of We. And so now
Pierre, I'm going to correct the record, Pierre. She said that individual was the lead for finance. So let's not speculate too far. Floor is yours.
I'll ask one last time, and then if not, we'll have to consider whether we pursue this further and more formally. Was this official the one who asked you to contact We?
Ms. Wernick.
Yes or no? If not, I'll move on. Yes or no?
I have to come back to, it was April context. It was we were working 12-hour days.
Right, that wasn't
the question. And I remember several conversations, and I am not comfortable.
You said that the minister. You said
specifying a direction.
My recollection. Mr.
I'm not being allowed to answer, Mr. Chair.
Poilevre,
you're not allowing yourself to answer.
Mr. Poilevre.
No, I am trying to take you back to mid-April.
This is not a court. I'm gonna. If we go over time on this panel, we will. And I don't want to see the witnesses browbeat. Ms. Wernick is doing her best. To give her time to answer. Ms. Wernick.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think it is important, the context. 12-hour days, lots of different conversations. Everybody's working at home, mostly on conference calls, and I do know that the official I mentioned was the lead on the student package at the Department of Finance, but my recollection is that I volunteered in the context of going through many organizations, some of which I have mentioned, Canada Service Corps partners.
This is an extremely long answer for a very direct question.
I'm not allowed to finish my answer.
Right, because you're not answering the question. You're very evasive. You're very evasive.
We'll let you, Mr. Poilevre, next question. Go ahead.
All right. So we know we're onto some trouble there. Moving on to the next question. When you you said that the We Charity had circulated a proposal. And that proposal had gone to ministers, and this was in mid-April. How did you know that?
I knew it. My recollection is I would know it for two different reasons. One, because Mr. Kielburger told me that it had been shared, particularly with Minister Ng, is my recollection. But I also recall approving a briefing note for Minister Chagger to meet with We Charity that spoke of the proposal. And I do recall some emails from other government officials at PCO and ISED also referring to this proposal. So I would prefer, if I could finish, I would prefer to provide...
Mr. Poilevre, let her finish your answer and then we'll go to the last question. Go ahead.
As I had said earlier, I would prefer to provide the committee with more accurate and complete information about that as best I can contribute to in terms of that proposal and who had it.
We look forward to that information. Mr. Poilevre, last question.
You claim that the contribution agreement was only approved on June 23rd, and yet there is evidence that the We Charity was advertising to its internally to its plan to administer this program on June the 12th, 11 days earlier. How is it possible that the We Charity knew 11 days before the contribution agreement was approved that it would be administering this program unless it was communicated to them by a back channel?
We entered into a negotiation of a contribution agreement with We Charity in mid-May. And it takes, as anybody familiar, it takes many weeks to negotiate a contribution agreement. Any activities that We Charity took on during the period leading up to this finalization and approval of the contribution agreement were completely at their own risk.
All right, so all the big newspapers have written a story about what just happened today, and in lesser degrees, like CBC has something way in the background, but this should be breaking news on every single channel. Leave your comment down below, like, subscribe, and comment, and have a good day.